In this video, I really want to talk about the jig head minnow and this shaking minnow technique that has just dominated tournament bass fishing. Now, this is definitely a technique that is going to work the best with using a forward-facing sonar, but you can use this in a pond without forward-facing sonar and still catch bass. It really all comes down to, this is a technique that the bass really like, and so learning it is really fun. Now, I haven't shot a lot of video over on this channel or BassFishingHQ with this technique because I know it's boring to watch. Watching a person look at a screen, but for you to actually go out there and fish with it, it is a lot of fun. And it is very intriguing at how much you learn about the bass themselves. So in this video, I actually wrote down there's 6 different things that I feel like I have really learned over about the last year and a half with this technique that I want to share with you for those of you who want to go out there and fish it. Now, before we get into this video, this one's brought to you by my apparel company, Finn Fishing. Right now for the month of September, I am running kind of a package deal. You can get a USA made sun shirt and a pair of sun gloves for 60 bucks. So it's real easy. All you got to do, add the sun shirt that you like to cart, add the sun gloves that you like to cart, and you will see that automatic discount at checkout. So shopping at Finn Fishing, it is truly the best way to help support this channel. I say it all the time, but it truly is, and I really appreciate all of you who have done so. So, all right, let's talk about the shaken minnow, the minnow shaking technique. So, like I said, what we have learned, obviously this is a great technique with forward-facing sonar, but the biggest thing about this is it's really like, if you do not have forward-facing sonar, it's kind of like fishing, you know, your standard ball head swim bait, which we have all done for years. You are just kind of doing it in a more finesse way. You know, a swim bait has a little kick to it. This really doesn't. You know, you tend to impart a little bit of action in the rod by kind of sitting there jiggling it constantly, but you also don't have to do that. You can literally just cast this thing out and reel it back to the boat. It's a very finessey way of triggering bass. Now, like I said, I have put down 6 big things that I have learned while using this with forward-facing sonar that I just really want to talk about, because I know that even though a lot of people are kind of against forward-facing sonar, I also know that there's a lot of people that still use it, and so I'm going to talk to you guys today. So the first thing, when it comes to this technique, I hate buying tungsten. I think we all do. It's expensive, but tungsten is a really good it's really good for this technique, using a tungsten ball head. And the biggest thing why is that tungsten is obviously harder than lead. And so tungsten is simply going to show up better on your forward-facing sonar. No matter what type of unit you're using, whether that's a Mega Live, a live scope, an active target, you will see harder objects better. And so tungsten, when you're using this, is a really big key, especially when you're using like really small baits. I mean, you might be using really small baits and really small weights, an 1/8 ounce at a time. And we'll talk about that here in just a moment. And so having that tungsten head, I'm telling you, it'll help that bait to show up a lot better on your units. All right, the next thing that I wrote down, bait and weight matter. Okay, that's an easy way for me to put it. The bait that you're using and the weight that you are using matter. Now for me, my standard go-to is actually this right here. My standard is a 3/16 ounce ball head jig. That is what I like. I feel like it is a very good, you know, just weight to use. It kind of allows you to do everything. Almost anywhere I go where I'm doing this technique, I will start with this exact setup, which is a 3/16 ounce weight. Now, the size of the hook in there, I like to get away with the smallest hook that you can get away with. Nowadays, so many different companies have different hook sizes to go with different ball heads that you buy. And so for me, kind of the best all-around hook size is usually a 2/0. So I really like a 3/16 and a 2/0 hook. That to me is the perfect all-around setup. Now, like I said, bait and weight matter. There are definitely days out there on the water where a bass will bite this bait better if you have a lot smaller weight. So if you're using a ball head that's an 1/8 ounce and maybe a smaller minnow style bait, you will see a significant reaction to bass, you know, maybe highly pressured bass or just bass that prefer a certain size. You also see at times where heavier weights, you know, 3/8 ounce, sometimes a 1/2 ounce for me. I haven't really gotten over anything over a 1/2 ounce, but sometimes those 1/2 ounce weights allow you to get a bait down quickly to a bass that may be suspended 20, 30 foot below the surface. Now, the size of your bait, I think, is very, very important. You will notice a difference if you're using this with forward-facing sonar. You will notice a difference on how bass react to baits. So what I always suggest, if you are going out there and you are going to be fishing this technique, try to have as many of these rigged up as you can. You know, if you can have 2 or 3 different spinning rods with you where you can have different size weights, different size baits, that will kind of help you to figure out what the bass wants. So bait and weight really matter in this. Don't skip out on it. But like I said, I always start out with this exact technique or this exact bait and weight right here. 3/16 ounce head, tungsten, and this is actually a spunk what's it called? A spunk shad. This is a great little bait. There's a number of versions of this bait that are out there on the market, but the spunk shad was kind of the original, but they're great little bait. All right, the next thing that I put on is speed. Speed is a very important part of this technique that I have started to realize. These bass tend to want that bait coming at a certain speed. And sometimes it's also speed that gets a bass to react, because what you will see if you're looking at your forward-facing sonar, you'll see your bait coming, you'll see bass, and they'll come up on that bait. And a lot of times if they're shooting off that bait, you got to kind of treat it like your bait is a natural bait fish. And most of the time, a bait fish out there is not going to just sit still all of a sudden when a big predator is coming at it. So a lot of times when I see a fish shoot up at this bait, I am going to speed up my retrieve a little bit, and it's that whole cat and mouse game. You are pulling that bait away from that fish, and you are a lot of times like making him want it even more. And so I have seen that you really have to play around with this a lot, especially if it's a single fish. If it's a single fish that shoots up, he is a lot more cautious than if it is multiples. If you have 2, 3, 4 fish come up at this bait at the same time, it's pretty much a done deal because they are competitive with each other, and one of them a lot of times is going to get it. Now, with that being said, I still will like to speed this bait up even if 3 or 4 fish are coming at it, because that is what is natural out there in the water. So I want this bait to look as natural as possible, and so speed is a big thing. There also are times where killing the bait and letting it pendulum down can be the ticket, and I haven't figured out when to go with which one. I just always experiment with it. Sometimes those fish are coming up on it, and if you just stop reeling, but you keep your line tight, that bait will go from like this to all of a sudden it's kind of swooping downwards, and fish will get it then. So it's just, all bass fishing is guessing and checking. You're guessing what weight size they want. You're guessing what bait size. You're guessing how they want this bait going up, going down, staying kind of horizontally. And that's all it is. Until you kind of get a number of fish to look at it and kind of figure out what they're doing, you just got to keep guessing. That's all it is to it. So speed is a big, important component. All right, the next thing, I put jiggle aggressiveness. Jiggle aggressiveness, I think, is really something that doesn't go talked about enough when it comes to this technique. I have found days where too much, jiggling of your rod is too much for the bass. I think that this is obviously something that happens, one, in highly pressured situations, but also in really cold water. When you have bass that have seen a lot of these baits, or you have bass that are in really cold water, I don't think that they want in aggressive motion. So a lot of times I am going to either lightly jig that rod, I mean very lightly, or sometimes I don't jiggle it at all. I will literally just reel it. And so reeling it through the water column, there's not a whole lot of motion to it, and that's the point. You want this bait to be very subtle. So sometimes just reeling this through the water column is all that you need to do, and you just have to watch, again, the fish's behavior to see how they want it. So jiggle aggressiveness, that's a very, very important one. There's just a lot of little nuances with this technique, and I literally wrote them down to try to tell you guys. All right, let's talk about the next one. Okay, this is another big one. There are days out there where bass want this thing dropped on their head, and there are days out there where the bass want this bait to come to them, if that makes sense. So sometimes, if you see a fish that's 60 foot out, sometimes you can cast, about 65, 70 foot out and let it literally fall on their head. And just so you know, when you do this technique, and things that I've learned with forward-facing sonar is that even if I cast the bait out on completely slack line, if I whip my rod back and it's falling on slack line, most of the time it is still going to pendulum a couple of feet towards me. So if there are days where you will see a fish at 60 or 65, don't cast it at 60 or 65, cast it about 5 feet past that fish in order to drop it right on its head. Now there are days where the bass, if you drop it on their head, you will see the bass. Like here's a bass, bam, your bait hits the water. You will see it as it gets closer to them, all of a sudden, it's like they notice it and they start to go up towards it. When that happens, usually that's when I engage my reel and I start kind of my jiggling motion very slightly, because usually when it stops and it goes up a hair, bam, that's when those fish are going to get it. So sometimes bass really like it dropped on their head. I've also seen days out there where you will not catch a fish. You will not get a fish to commit to that bait if you drop it on their head. You have to cast this thing way past the fish. So if a fish is sitting at 60 foot, I'll cast it at 90 to 100 feet, let it get down to its level, and then I will start my retrieve. And I actually bring that minnow all the way to that fish. And then that kind of motion, I think it's just more natural to a fish. So again, sometimes in those high pressured situations, it seems like they want a bait brought to them as opposed to it being dropped straight on their head. Now, if you can get it, if you notice that those fish do like it dropped on their head, that's actually the best case scenario, because it helps you to be so efficient. I mean, you can line up your trolling motor. You're like, bam, that fish is at 65 foot. You make about a 70 foot cast. As that thing's falling, it comes up, it's a fish catch. And with me saying that, this is the biggest thing that you should understand, is that I'm not talking about every single fish falls for this. No matter what you do, I have never been out on the water where every fish that I'm casting at actually hits the bait. It's like 1 out of 10, and that is even on a good day. There are days out there where I'll cast at like 30 or 40 fish before I get the first one to bite. So this is not a always going to catch them technique. I think that's a huge misconception with this technique and with forward-facing sonar in general. But the ones that do want it, it's kind of like fishing down the bank. When you fish down the bank, you probably pass by 10 or 15 fish with a lure before you catch one of them that wants to bite it. And maybe even more than that. I remember years ago, I went down, I went to a local lake, and they were shocking it. I got to go in the boat with them while they were shocking, and they went down this stretch that like me and buddies have fished before, and I have never seen this many fish on this stretch in my life. And I had just talked to someone who had fished down this stretch. It was a popular stretch, had caught nothing. And there was like 50 or 60 bass that we shocked up in a 100-yard section. It was just one of those things that blew my mind at how many fish are there. So just like the bass aggressiveness in shallow water are the same thing with forward-facing sonar. Like 1 out of 10, 1 out of 20 might actually hit the bait. There might be those really good days where 1 out of 3, 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5 actually hit it. But again, that doesn't happen that often. All right, let's talk about the last thing that I wrote down, which is distance between fish and the bait matter. And this is something that I've been kind of talking to my buddy about, is that I feel like with this bait, I've been a few places like down on in the Carolinas where I use this a lot recently, and even in other places where I felt like you could get this bait too close to a bass at times. If you are casting this bait out and bringing it over its head, sometimes it seemed like the fish almost wanted to travel to actually hit it. The ones that you would like, if this is a fish and I'm bringing this bait by, the ones that I brought it right into their face, they would just turn and slowly follow the bait, almost at the same speed. Almost at the same speed. Those fish never hit it. Now, if I had this thing 3 to 5 foot above its head, it seemed like that motion of that fish looking up and then going up was what actually made them commit to the bait. So I just feel, I don't know if there's an exact science behind this. I don't know that it's always, but it's just something that I've noticed is that sometimes bass want to travel to hit a bait, or at least the ones that are going to commit tend to travel, if that makes sense. So anyways, those are the 6 big things that I feel like I've learned with this technique. Look, I know it's boring to watch, but you cannot deny its effectiveness. And so that's why I wanted to talk about it. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a like, comment down below, and I will see you guys tomorrow.